हेलो दोस्तों। क्लास 21 EIC एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन जुडिशरी द फोकस ऑफ द जस्टिस सिस्टम was one of the compromise between two party and not one punishment. British argument that there was an absence of rule of law, that is equality before the law and uniform application of law. As the Pandit and Molvi interrupted the religious law differently in the different case. The background of the party to the case of influence in interpretation and application of the law. Dual government in Bengal 1765 to 72. Muhammad Reza Khan headed Diwani of for EIC Nizamat on the behalf of Nawab. As EIC did not want to change the administration much due to the ideology of Orientalism, therefore Indian officials continued to the decision makers. And direct government 1772. EIC implement its administration and rule because they believed that the British administration would be more efficient, leading to the better law and the order of the more revenue collection, which that down since the Great Bengal famine in 1717 to the fulfill the white man's burden by the providing fair administration without nepotism, a rule of law equally applicable to Indians, therefore ending the feudal privileges. It would allow the EIC to establish the sovereignty in the minds of the people. And that is the established from the control in the polity of Bengal by removing Indians from the senior position. And in the administration, British judicial system in Bengal, Warren Hastings system of 1772, in Diwani Adalat at the district level, European DC was also made the judge, however, assisted by the Pandit and Maulvis. In Nizamat Adalat at the district level, Qazi and Muftis were continued to head the court but were now the put under the supervision of European DC. EIC caused the Pandit and Maulvi's corruption since the law and order, the criminal justice were the sensitive subject. Therefore, the continuation of the Qazi and Muftis. The Sadat, Diwani and Nizamat were now headed by the Governor General and his council members. There was a conflict between Gigi of Bengal and the SC at Calcutta set up under the Regulation Act 1773 due to the lack of clarity jurisdiction of the law too. Changing in the judiciary in 1773. Separation of power at the level of European official was the implemented that Europeans official who was a DC not be a judge, and the same time the vice versa prevent conflict of interest. The bring the justice physically colored the people Diwani Adalat and district level where the replaced the 18th Mufassil Court headed by the European officials / judges. Supreme Court at Calcutta. Judges appointment by the Crown. It was set up in the 1774 under Regulating Act of 1773. In 1781, the Bengal Judicature Act defined the judiciary of the Supreme Court at Calcutta as the all cases in Calcutta. All cases related to EIC property at the Fort Williams. All cases involving British born subject except for the act done by the EIC official in the official capacity. This case went to the GG of Bengal. King's Bench in London had the cases against the principal servant of the EIC in India. For example, a corruption case against the Gigi of Bengal. High Court in Madras 1800, High Court in Bombay in 1823. In 1775, the Committee of the 11th Pandit and 1778 Committee of the Qazi and Muftis were set up for the codification of Hindu and Islamic law, respectively, so there was no different subjective uh, interpretation of the Hindu/Islamic law. In 1781, a code of 1781 made written the order of the compulsory and the rules for the court of the functioning framed. Cornwallis Code 1793. The Cornwallis introduced the separation of the power at the level of European DC to reduce the absence of power by the revenue official, therefore the protecting the property right of the jamindars. For provincial court of the appeal, where the added to the reduce the overall jurisdiction burden. All the court were headed by the European judges, where the Indians were removed from the all senior position. In the judiciary, due to corruption of the Qazi and Muftis, the office of the Nayab and Nazim were now abolished. The appointment of a wakil/lawyers allowed to the fight the case. Therefore, the new class of lawyers emerged in India. The judicial system of Ratwari cases. The riots were made the land owner, and therefore the court were the overburdened due to the large number of property owners and therefore the large number of revenue related disrupts. And district courts were physically far away from the poor riots living in the village. Therefore, the system was replaced 1884 Madras on the advice of the Thomas Munro. Separation of power was ended at the level of the DC, which was also given the judicial power, so he and his the subordinates can dispose the cases at ground level. And this also lead to the greater Indianization of the judiciary at the lower levels. They expanded the Bombay in the 1819 Elphinstone codification of the law. Under the Macaulay, the legal member of added the Governor General of India and India Council via the Charter of the 1833. The result was CPC, IPC and CRPC courts. Indian High Courts Act 1861 lead to the three high courts in three presidencies in 1865. Example, Supreme Court at Calcutta. Sadat, Diwani and Nizamat were the merged from the High Court of the Calcutta. Police. The Mughal system of police continued till 1781. A 1781 system was Warren Hastings. Jamindars at the village level reported the DC/DM. Jamindars atrocities because of the improper supervision due to the inadequate number of the DC. Cornwallis system/ Daroga system at the district level DC+/DM and below the Daroga at the Thana levels. Each Thana had a 30 square miles of the area under it. The police power of Jamindars taken away. The district was divided into the Thanas. The result was the system failed and the Daroga Jamindars annexed because of the instruments of the coercion in 1800s. Jamindars bribed Darogas, therefore the illegal having the armed men. Cornwallis blamed Indians for the negative of the system. It was applied to Madras in 1802 and the negatives of the lead to its removal and police powers were given to the lower bureaucrats under the DC/DM where the lead to the operation by the Mirasi Das. Indian Police Act 1861. Therefore, the first time a well-defined hierarchy of the specialist with a clear chain of the command from the top to bottom was set up. After the 1857 revolt, the British ensured Indians were excluded from all senior positions. Police Commission 1902 recommended the appointment of the educated Indians in the police force. However, Indians supported in the ranks were European, began because the British did not trust India. Civil services. Cornwallis reduced the patronage that the promoted the merit-based selection, increased the salary to the curb corruption, ended private trade by the EIC official, and reintroduced the separation of power at the level of DC. Cornwallis is also known as the father of the civil service. He organized the civil service into the converted and the unconverted civil services. In 1833, lower bureaucracy and judicial position opened Indians by the Charter 1833. In 1853, the converted civil services was opened to the Indians as the Charter of 1853 prescribed an exam for civil services that was opened in Indians. In 1855, first civil service exam was held. With the 1857 revolt, British ensured that exam continue to be held only in London, and the age limits was kept low. In 1860, there was the pressure from the Indian national movement for nationalization of civil services. In 1878, Lytton brought the Statutory Civil Service Act 1878. Under the Statutory Civil Services, Indian would be nominated to the officer rank, but the Lyttons ensured that only loyal Indians are nominated. In the Indian Council Act of 1892, statutory civil service was abolished and the converted civil service was the renamed Indian Civil Services, and the rearranged the provincial civil services. Government of India Act 1919, the decision for the simultaneous exam in Indians and first held in 1922. The topic of the next class, socio-religious reform. Class 22. Socio-religious reform. Introduction. Till 1813, Orientalistic ideology operated. Therefore, the now interference by the British in the socio-religious domains. And this was also because of the desire to prevent the negative reaction from the Indians. However, the 1813 Orientalism gave away the liberalism, the evangelicalism, and the utilitarianism. Therefore, the push for the westernization of India. Therefore, the Western education social reform were introduced by British mainly after 1813. Regarding education, the debate on the Western education via Indian education from 1813 to 33 settled in 1835 favored the Western education in English language via Macaulay's Mutiny on the Education in 1835. Reason for the push for Western education. First, decrease in the cost of the administration by having the Indians lower bureaucracy. Second, creates the loyal class in the form of educated middle class. Brown Sahib argued Macaulay that is Indian from outside, British from inside, and Western education glorify British, therefore increasing stability of the British rule. 3. To create the market for British good and therefore increase the British exports. 4. The middle class Indians supported Western education due to their personal interest in jobs created by the British rule, bureaucracy, lower doctor, teacher, engineer, etc. Plus, they believed that only Western education and the Western science can modernize India and lead to the Indianization. For educated Indians, Social reform were also response to the British civilizational critics of Indians and increased the 19th century. And now the British argued that the greatness of the Indian civilization was myth. Therefore, the cultural nationalism was a reason for the social reform. Was the reform wanted to the prove that a Indian scripture do not support social ill. B. To prove that the practice Indians can achieve the greatness of the past and therefore Indians. Civilization was not inferior. Two group of the early social reform first half of 19th century. A. Those who relied purely on the logic slash reason slash rationality to argue for the social reform. Second, those who use the scripture to argue for the social reform and therefore the try to the find support for logic slash reason slash rationality in Indian scriptures. Therefore, they argued that the true Indian religion supported social reforms and is the line with the doctrines of the reason and humanism. Humanism is called to focus on the happiness of the man in all sphere of life. This was also the have the great acceptability of the suggested reforms. However, for the both kind of the reforms, logic slash reason slash rationality was the infallible, non negotiable. Therefore, even that they second kind of argued that the Vedas are superior in the case for the slash between the reason and the scripture. They would be support the reason and would be argued for the reinterpretation for even the change in the scripture. Print culture. There was the push promote the print culture by British men like John Macaulay, Governor of Bombay, and Charles Metcalfe, GGI 1835 to 36, etc. Western educated middle class also took the print culture, and therefore there was the development of the press journalism in India. Social reform used the press as the main tool of the discussing and the debating the Western science and scripture, social reforms, social issues, ideal worship, priestcraft, child marriage, no widow remarriages, infanticide, casteism, polygamy, and the polytheism. Allegedly banded child sacrifices in Sagar Island, Bay of Bengal. Henry Vivian Derozy and Young Bengal movements, 1830. Derozy was the Eurasian teacher at the Hindu College, Calcutta, and in his students are the young Bengal. Their primary focus was the using the reason slash rationality slash questioning everything Western sciences and on the atheism. The print their primary focus was on this reason slash rationality, questioning everything Western sciences and the atheism. Therefore, they argued for the reform only based on the doctrine of the reason and neglected religion. There is integrated free thinking among his students. They intellectually challenged the orthodoxy in the Hinduism. And like the Raja Ram Mohan Rai, the young Bengal also demanded the trial by the jury, separation of the powers, Indianization of the civil services, and freedom of the press. Demanded the outside social reforms. They set up the Society for the Acquisition of the General Knowledge, 1838, where they debated, discussed Western science and social reforms. Result failed because they could not develop any mass movement for the social reform due to the total faith of the logic, reason, rationality, and the no regard of the religion, while the target population was deeply religious. Therefore, they got aligned from the masses. However, they become the famous due to their radical ideas. They becomes the notorious for the eating non-veg and the drinking wine. And the Raja Ram Mohan Roy and his Brahmo Samaj, 1828. Raja Ram Mohan Rai is called the father of modern Indian, the student and scholar of Veda, Christianity, Parsism, Sanskrit literature. He come to believe that the Vedas are the superior and the supported doctrine of reason. Raja Ram Mohan Roy believed that the social reforms are not possible without the religious reform, as many social practices were rooted in the religions and the high importance of the religion and Indian social reform. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was against other the worldwideness plus against the doctrine of the karma act of the past life and determining the present life plus against the doctrine of the incarnation gods of the human birth. However, the Brahmo Samaj 1828 took a no definitive stand regarding the karma and the transmigration of the soul rebirth, left the belief that the individual Brahmo Samajist positive for the example good deeds in the present life for the better next life plus removal for fear and death of the due next birth slash these two are among the core belief of the Hinduism slash therefore the preventing alienation from the masses. And his response to the British critics was that back to the pure past of the Vedas, ideal social life, and therefore agreeing that there is a degeneration of the present time, but also argued in the favor of the glorious scientist past. And however, for him, rationality was the infallible in the not the Vedas. Wanted Western education, Western sciences. Instead, the Indian education, as for him, only the Western education would modernize India, Indian polity, economy, and society. Example opposed the setting of the Sanskrit College in Calcutta 1824 by the government wanted to prayer money and to be spent the Western education. His idea and efforts influenced the decision in the favor of Western education in English language by the Macaulay's Mutiny 1835, which the become the main policy document and education in India. The achieving social reform he set up the Brahmo Samaj 1828. Brahmo Samaj wanted against the idolatry, priestcraft, sati and polytheism. Raja Ram Mohan Roy argued that caste division divides, which is why modern nationalism and the sense of the unity tackling the among the Indians. Raja Ram Mohan Rai argued Upanishad that translated them the Bangas and proved that Hinduism favors the modernization, that there is only one God within the Hinduism. Universalism, Hindus God is equal to Christian God is equal to Islamic God is equal to God is one. Raja Ram Mohan Rai took help of the British authority, legislative, executive, judiciary, and authority of the British personality for his social reforms. For the example, worked with the William Benting for the abolition of the sati reasons. The greed of the relatives was the primary reason was as they did not want to uh, sphere of the property with the widows. Stereotypes of the ideal wife. The sati was not a widespread phenomenon, exists mainly in the Bengal among the upper castes and earlier in Vijayanagar Empire slash Rajputs as a Johor, but for the different reason. Ch- Chastity slash dignity. In the 1800s, it was the started even the lower caste due to the desire for the social mobility and better status for the one of the caste in the caste hierarchy. The missionaries opposed sati but not failed. Therefore, the main role of the Roy in the sati abolition in the 1829 scriptures based on the debates took place between the reformist Brahmo Samaj and Orthodox section led by the Dharma Sabha of Radhakant Dev. William Bentinck made the precondition for the abolition of sati by the law, and that is the power to the sati is not line with the scripture. And notice the Orientalism of the Bentic. Roy proved that sati is not murder as per every shastras, and Sati Abolished Act 1892 was the past, and the Brahmo Samaj BS 1828. The Devendra Nath Tagore DBT. He took over the leadership after the death of the Roy 1833. Brahmo Samaj slash BS was a major religious movement based on the modern monotheism among the educated middle class upper caste Bengalis, not among the masses. DBT gave the oriental organizational strength of the BS. Keshav Chandra Sen KCS was the radical reformer, while the DBT was a gradualistic wanted gradual reform, middle mild goal, mild methods. The Keshav Chandra Sen was radical as argued strongly in the favor of women-related reforms. For example, against the child marriage and pro-widow remarriage, plus the attacked casteism and questioned the high the caste leadership of the BS and the supported inter-caste marriages. The issue of the castes and women were considered the sensitive by the gradualistic like the DBT in the early 19th century. Therefore, the DBT feared that the alienation of the Hindus from the BS. Keshav Chandra Sen tried to make BS mass movement a movement by the spreading its among the common man outside the culture and even the outside Bengal. Keshav Chandra Sen started missionary activities, wanted Brahmanism as the alternate religions of the Hinduism, while the DBT did not want to the strong methods. Radicalism of the Keshav Chandra Sen differences with the DBT. Devendranath Tagore caused the split. Therefore, the Keshav Chandra Sen set up the BSOI, Brahmo Samaj of India, 1866, and Devendranath Tagore set up Adi Brahmo Samaj, 1866. Adi means original. Efforts of the Keshav Chandra Sen lead to the Brahmo Marriages Act of 1872. Under the widow remarriages, intercaste marriages were the generally valid. Lord Mayo. It failed because the required the bridge of the groom to the leave the Hinduism and the converted the Brahmism. Further, the split of the Brahmo Samaj of India when the Keshav Chandra Sen married his minor daughter. Therefore, now the formation of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj 1878. Therefore, the Brahmo Samaj failed due to the personality differences in the goal and the method due to the multiple split. Maharashtra. The Paramahansa Mandali 1849. It worked like the young Bengal, therefore the failed like them. The second, Pratna Samaj PS 1867, set up by the Atmaranga Panduranga efforts of Keshav Chandra Sen. Main personalities M.G. Ranade, M.G. Bhandarkar and K.T. Telang. A strong goals but the mild methods. Focused on the social reform including issue women and the caste. Therefore, a head goal like the Keshav Chandra says, but followed by the method of the gradualism, as did not break the Hinduism, and therefore the methods like the DBT. PS opened the branches outside Maharashtra. Therefore, example Gujarat, Karachi, Madras. Slow progress of the social reform in Madras due to the high casteism. Slow progress of the Western education. Class 23. The child marriages. Reason. The Garbhadharan ceremony was the religious basis as per which the marriage before the property and the consummation of the marriages post poverty. Due to the religious basis, not just a socio-religious issue. Therefore, the high use of the scripture by the reform of the Orthodox Hindu. Efforts of the Vidyasagar lead by the age of the Consent Act of 1860, which the set up the minimum age of the consumption at the 10 years. The A.K. Datta cited the medical opinion against the child marriages. Rukambai case 1884 to 88. The Rukambai was the marriage as an infant after the decades of the separation living. She argued that the marriage was invalid. At 22 years, Rukambai was taken to court in the husband for the denial of the conjugal right. The Rukhambai Defense Committee of the Reform was led by the Mahalbari, whose the 1884 noted that child marriage and the enforced the widowhood as the created by the enormous controversy. The Orthodox Hindu supported Rukhambai's husband. The Rukhambai lost the case. The 2 years later, the 1890s death of the 11-year-old Fulmoni due to the sexual abuse by the husbands led to the age of the Consent Bill of 1891, which the set up the minimum age of the consummation at the 12 years. The now a massive controversy as the Orthodox Hindus who control the masses opposed the bill. The Tilak argued that British no right to the interfere in Indian customs and religious, that the any reform should be the product of the not government action but social movements of the Indians. The R.G. Bhandarkar of the Pune Deccan College should be the reached on the Dasarath Nath Dharma Shastra that the Hinduism allowed to marry the post poverty. The overall reform against the child marriage failed. The widow remarriages. The problem of the child widow exists due to the child marriages due to the high age gap. The efforts of Vidyasagar lead to the Hindu Marriage Act of the 1856. However, upon the remarriage, the woman lost the right to the poverty and the death of the husband. In Maharashtra, Vishnu Shastri Pandit in 1866 and Telugu speaking area Madras Veer Salim Bagh Patralu set up the Society of the Widow Remarriages. Therefore, the debate continued even after the 1856 law. Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra made the efforts among the lower caste for the widow remarriage due, but he failed. The Pandit Ramabai in Maharashtra married a lot later married a man from the lower caste. She later got the widow and the worker for the women related reform. She set up the widows home in Maharashtra. Orthodox Hindu finally on the scripture based on debate, that is the Hinduism does not allow the widow remarriages due to the huge debate. The issue become the now the lower caste which the earlier practice the widow remarriage stopped it. By 1900 only the 38 widow remarriage in Maharashtra. It succeeded only the Haryana as here it's already being practiced. The character of the reforms. Therefore, reform were led by the upper caste and educated Brahmins. And the major focus on women-related reform. Since the British used the benchmark of the status of women to decide the status of the civilization. However, no leadership of women and hurt the success of reform. They were led by the Brahmins but were anti-priest. They were the response to the criticism of Indian civilization by the British that increased the post 1813. They were inspired by the doctrine of the reason of the Hinduism, a reliance on the British legislative executive authority. Therefore, the top-down reforms and not based on any mass movement. This hurt the success reform and therefore did not try to build a mass movement. For example, Roy used the complex Sanskritization Bengali prose not understood the common man. The Pratna Samaj only the 72 members, therefore reform target was only the upper caste. Also the leadership of only the upper caste, therefore the lower caste could not associate, and the no women leadership, thus the no mass movement. The use of the British authority lead to the disrupt among the mass towards the reforms. The primary importance was to scriptures as a reform. Orthodox section British gave the primary importance of the scripture. Therefore, the reform is searches for the modernity and rationality within the scripture and did not suggest that the adaptation of the British culture. No are no grounds that it was the superior. Therefore, the state largely silent on the issue of the casteism and even women's issue in the early phases. These issues were the considered too sensitive. Reform favored alienation from the upper caste Hindus. They were themselves from the upper caste, therefore the neglected caste issues. The most followed by the method of the gradualism. The exist of rival organization, the orthodox section, having the great support from the masses. The differences in the goals and methods contributed to the failure of reform, like the Brahmo Samaj post 1857 revolt. The post 1857 revolt was also a shift towards the great culture nationalism, also the towards the revivalism. Therefore, the reformism of the pre 1857 revivalism meet the stronger assertion of the Indian tradition. There was a no greater assertion based on the culture nationalism by reformer as well, like the Ramakrishna Paramahansa, Swami Vivekananda, and the Swami Dayanand Saraswati. As per the negative revivalism, Hindu post was the glorious and the generation took the place under the Muslims and the Christians rules. Also, not just the Hinduism is the superior, but therefore religious in the inferior. The contrast the culturally nationalist reform believed the universalism that all religions lead to the God and that God is one. Ram Krishna Paramahansa, he was the ascetic. He believed in the meditation, renunciation, and monasticism. And he did not directly criticize the colonial rule, but due to his pure focus on the Hinduism, rejected the Western values indirectly. The Swami Vivekananda, he believed in the superiority of the Hinduism but also in universalism. He set up the Ramakrishna mission and the name of his Guru 1897 the spared the idea of the Vedanta and the social work. He argued the Christian would be a better Christian if he followed the philosophy of Vedanta, therefore did not focus on the conversion but on the values of the Vedanta. He argued for the ideas of the Daridra Narayan and that God resides in the every, including the poor and the superior of the Jiva, the worship of the Shiva. Therefore, believed in the social work as the path of the spiritualism. Argued that Indian masculinity is the superior Western masculinity, as the former focus on the physical strength but also in the mental spiritualism. Therefore, the Indians are not the feminines, as the argued the British and the India's masculinity is a superior. He started the movement for the setting of the Akharas/gym. He believed in the supremacy of the Vedas and the accepted ideology and the some Hindus rituals as they especially help in the develop religiosity, and this lead to the greater acceptability in the masses. He represented Hinduism at the Parliament of the Religious in Chicago, in USA, 1893. Therefore, raising the prestige of Indian culture and argued here the Western nationalism and Indians. Spiritualism should be come together for the welfare of the mankind. Netaji Bose called him as the spiritual father of the INM in Bengal. Therefore, the represent cultural nationalism and the prior widow being the communal Arya Samaj 1875. It was started by the Swami Dayanand Saraswati radical reform. He believed in the Vedas and infallible supremacy of Vedas, real scientific truth and rationality. There is a Vedas promoted Hinduism as a religion of the book authority is a final like the Islam and Christianity. The goal was to go back to the pure Vedic past. Therefore, the Arya Samaj was an aggressive response to the British Christian and the racism, strongly argued against the caste system and the untouchability, promoted the intercaste marriages, supported the Varnashram and the organized society. He strongly opposed the idolatry, priestcraft and infanticide, child marriage, polytheism and polygamy. He strongly supported the widow remarriages and women's education, failed because they demanded radical reform and therefore did not go support the Orthodox Hindus and gradualistic reform. He was the successful in Punjab and northwestern provinces. After 1883, Arya Samaj became the revivalist. Now began in a Shuddhi movement from the conversion of the Hindu movements. In response, Sikhs started to the Sikh Sabha movement and Muslims started Tanzeen and the Tabligh movement. Arya Samaj also began the cow protection movement and there was a communal right in 1893. Therefore, increase in communal tension in post 1883, a peasant revolt and tribal uprising was 1857 revolt, the culmination of small and big rebellions in first 100 years of British rule. The highlight the similarities between the various grievances caused. As the provinces offers, failure was raised collectively in 1857. The grievances of the peasant in pre-1857, the farming system of 1772, Bengal provision by the revenue farmers who over-extracted land revenue, and his the support the British officials in the permanent settlement. 1793, main oppressor was Jamindar, was the extracted high rent and the extracted above which were now the illegal and no corruption right to occupant right to the tenants and riots. Jamindars were supported by the British official and courts. Now Mahalwadi system was the high land revenue by the British loss of the land in the government auction, the high interest rates by the money lenders, loss of the land due to the indebtedness of the money lenders, so the contracts, the farming operation by the indigo planters, the Bengal who forced the rios and the cultivate the indigos in 25% of occupant and the indebtedness the planters who force the rios and take advance for the buying indigo seeds and acid dress, and the rios were not given to the remunerative price for the indigo cultivation, which led to the continuation of the indebtedness. Therefore, the riots against forces take the further loan and the planters cultivates indigo. The soil productivity is the greatly by the indigo cultivation. If the riots refuse when the vacated from the land by planters which the no occupancy rights, therefore corrupts oppressor is the indigo planters and the British court, since the contract is the enforceable and the oppressed by the indigo agents of the planters. The grievances was take religions was under the threat due to the Christian missionary and the British indigo revenue rent free tenure and lands. The religious sect. Religion helped in the giving organization in the form of leaders, unity among those who are the revolted, especially when in the sect of revolt. Class 24. The tribal grievances. The two issues were the tribal autonomy and the living in the forest. The grievances was that there the agrarian order and the life were the turned upside down by the British rule. The outsiders in the form of the British law, British land revenue system, the British government officials, outsiders in the form of zamindars, revenue farmer, merchants and money lenders. British businesses due to the railroad construction, mining, commercial exploitation of the forest, example, greed for the timber. The Christian missionary for the spread of Christianity. The primary concern of the British was land revenue extraction. Therefore, the many cases, Jamindar of the plains were the made landlords of the British areas. Forest land was the formed out of the revenue farmers. In the some cases, the tribal chief was recognized as a landowner and the tribal is a tenants and some cases tribals as the landowners. Now there was the indebtedness money lenders due to the land revenue systems of the British and the operation and the account of the British land revenues. Tribal lost and the land outsiders. The autonomy of tribal chiefs and the tribals was the hot because of the application of the British law in the civil and the criminal matters. British law the banned the jhum cultivation, paddy slash burn cultivation, banned hunting because of the British wanted to settle the peasant communities for the easy land revenues collection and the maximize land revenues. There was a loss of the homes and the tribals because British forest laws categorized the forest into the rivers and the no access the tribals where the tribal can use the forest produce hut only the personal consumption not for sale. The uncategorized and were open to all. Loss of the home due to the land acquisition on the account of the railroad project. Tribals were made of the forced labor in this project. Missionaries post 1813 lead to the religious interference. The peasant revolts were the civil uprising where the leadership was provided by the elites, rajas, mobility and zamindars etc. The INM leaders called the pre-1857 revolt the prehistory of the modern nationalism. Western educated middle class supported the benefited from British rule while the peasant and tribals benefited the British rule violently. Civil uprising 1857. The Raja Chaid Singh of the Banaras revolted because the removed due to the non-payment of the revenue 1778 to 81 and disposed the Nawab Wajid Ali Shah Awad revolted 1799 with the peasant support. The Bundels of the chief of Bundelkhand revolted the peasant support due to the interference by the British resident post-subsidiary alliance signed after the Second Anglo-Marathas War 1803 to 05. Polygars revolted from the 1799 to 1805 due to the loss of the status due to the British rule of the law and the Rayatwari. In the Madras, the High Land Revenue demanded that the hot riots. The Diwan Velu Thampi of the Travancore revolted with the peasant support in 1809 due to the interference of the British resident post subsidiary alliance of the 1805. The revolt where the peasant took the initiative pre-1857. The Rangpur rebellion in 1783 in the northern Bengal against the oppression of the revenue farmers. Mysore 18 30 to 31, the revolt by the peasant against the Wadawar dynasty, British agent due to the high land revenue. The religions played the important role. Religions played the important role in following the peasant revolt. The Sannyasi and Fakir rebellion Bengal and Bihar from 1760 to 1850 with the peak in 1800 where the 15,000 members fought against the British. The reason were the high rents and the land of the free tenures and the domination of the domestic trade of the Bengals by the EIC agents. The Pagalpanthi revolt in East Bengal 1823 to 33 due to oppression by the Jamindars and under the permanent settlements. Tuti Mir in 24 Parganas in 1831 due to the oppression by the Jamindars and the indigo planters. Fakiri revolts in 1813 in Bengal by Dadu men due to the oppression by the Jamindars and the indigo planters. Mopilla revolt Malabar in 1840. They were the Muslim riots. It was against the oppression by the big landlords where the Jamins and were Hindus. It took the communal color because of the specific identifications of the riots and loaners. The tribals uprising pre 1857. Coal uprising 1831 to 32. The Chota Nagpur and the Singh Bhumi region, Bihar and Odisha. The reason was the influx of the outsider. And when the Rajas of the Chota Nagpur formed out of the lands the merchant and money lenders, the Khasi uprising 1833. Their reason was the Brahmaputra Valley, Siholot Road, led by the loss of the land influx of the outsider, the British businesses, British officials. It was the lead by the Tirath Singh. The Santhal Rebellion 1855 to 56 by the Santhal under the Sidho and the Kanu Murmu. The reason was the loss of their fatherland in Rajmahal Hills, Jharkhand, to outsider Dekhus. British gave the tribal land to the non-Santhal Jamindars and the money lenders, and there was also railroad construction. 15,000 Santhal died the fighting. The character of the pre-1857 revolt. The modern nationalism was the missing, where the not all Indians movements, the no coordination with the each others, no outside lenders, lack of the proper planning was the spontaneous in the many cases. The goal was not democracy. However, they were called the prehistory of the modern nationalism as they were the political had the anti-colonial sentiments. The political movement has a ideology, organization, and the programs and is the public. The ideology was they were wanted to bring back and the moral order disturbed by the British rule. Therefore, the anti-colonial ideology was there. The political symbolism was there in the form of the grand merchants and the example idea of the fatherland and Adamni Koha Santhals religions based the bonds of the form of the sects of the provided organization and leaders. The organization was the evident in the many cases. They set up there the government collected self-imposed taxes set up in their courts. The program was there. The large meeting were held and the planning was done by the Santhal. The peasant and tribals know there the oppressor and the tools of the oppression. They did not attack the life of oppressor in the many cases, but they are the property and the account book of the money lenders. The Santhal declared that traditionally they have the hunted animals and now the hut they are the oppressors. The crimes were done secretly, while the political action was the public and their revolt was the public. For the example, Santhal gave the prior warning to the British in 1855 before the revolting. The tribal revolt post 1857. The Mundas ya Aplungas revolt 1899 to 1900. The Chota Nagpur, the lead by the Birsa Mundas. The reason was the loss of the land to outsider and the missionary activities of the Christian missionaries. The action was the people come to the believe in the supernatural power of the Birsa. Therefore, the religion in this case gave the courage of the against the British mighty British. The religion also provided narrative was the Birsa composed the British rule with the Kaliyunga and the similar to the rule of the Ravana's wife the Mandodaris. The political symbolism was the present as the Mundas revolted the Christmas of 1899. Rampa ya Faturi Rebellion 1879. The Rampa hills of the Andhra Pradesh in a region where the commercial exploitation of the forest, road construction led by the loss of land to merchants and money lenders, a restriction on the use of the forest resources, prohibition of the podu. Tax on the toddy. The futuri was the lead by the Mutradars was where local estate holders, land owners. It was the crushed by the 1880 and the 1920 to 22 NNC as a tribal did not violation of the forest law and the Aluri Sitaram Raju who had lead by the Gandhian struggles revolted violently as they believed that the Indian can be liberated only by the forces. Therefore, now they continue the tradition of the Fituri and he was the executed in 1924. The early Indian national movement / post 1857 peasant movement and revolts and the new futures emerged in the present peasant movement of post 1857. Peasants sought the greater awareness of the British law and the institution organization themselves the politically. Now the middle class began taking up the leadership of the peasant. Therefore, the banning of the early INMC Indigo Revolt 1859 to 63 in Bengal. Background. In 1788, EIC began indigo plantation by giving the loans to the 10 European planters in Bengal. European planter leased the land from the zamindars forced by the EIC. The indigo system of the cultivation was the niche cultivation of Bengal. The planters bought the hired land and the hired the labor from the cultivation of indigo had the buy the large lands and the mobilize the land bulk low and which was the challenges. In the Riyotwari system, Bengal leased the large land from the zamindars planters signed by the contract with the 10 tenants Riyot, where Riyot must grow indigo on the list 25% of occupant land. And the planters gave the advance and the loan was the low interest rates to the Riyot and they gave the indigo seeds drills. The Tin Kathia system in Bihar was the same as the Riyotwadi system but forced the grow indigo on the 15% or the 3 by 20 of the occupied land. In pre-1857 revolt against the indigo planters were the Titu Mir in 24 Parganas and the Faraji revolt under the Dadu Mian east of the Bengal. The fertility of the soil destroyed by the indigo cultivation. The revolt began due to the fall in the international prices of the indigo and forced the cultivation and the perpetual independence of the planters. The trigger was the emphatic LG of the Bengal who asked the DC to take the side of the riots. The Rioth refused advances and refused the cultivated indigo indigo, and the India did a social boycott of the agent of the indigo planters. Jamindars supported the riots as against the domination of the rural economy by the indigo planters. The use of the British court as the planters went to the court enforced the contract of the indigo cultivation. By riots began the non-rent campaign, and the planters tried to evict riots. Now the riots went to the court to enforce their the occupancy rights under the Rent Act 1859. The role of the educated middle class and the Christian missionaries. The Dinbandhu Mitra wrote the play The Nil Darpan in 1860, which showed the operation of riots and therefore the increase in awareness. The Bengali poets Mitchell Madhusudan Dutt translated the play of the English, and Christian missionary James Long published the leading of the awareness of the England. The Indian press began the campaign by the writing editors. The British Indigo Cult Association 1851 or organization of the landlords supported the riots resulted in the Indigo Communication Commission 1860. It asked asked riots the fulfill present contract but was free to not sign the contracts in the future. Therefore, by 1863, indigo cultivation shifted from Bengal to Bihar from the Tin Kathia system. The Pavana Agrarian Leagues 1873. Their grievances was the high land and the illegal above and the mindars, not the respecting occupancy right under the Rents Act 1859. The action was the peasants organized themselves into the leagues and the pooled money to the fight in the courts. And Naya Man reflected the movement in the other districts. The result was the Bengal Tenancy Act, which gave the more protection to tenants regarding occupancy rights. The educated middle class got divided as it was not the foreigners who were under the attack but Indian zamindars. The Deccan riots 1875 in Maharashtra. During US Civil War there was an increase in cotton prices but later in the price fall. The grievances was the not operation by the money lenders via high interest rate on loan and loss of the lands due to the indebtedness at the high land revenue in Retwari and loss of the land in the government auction. The action was the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha 1870 of the middle class allocated 17,000 signature on the power of the attorney represent the riot from the British government. Therefore, the government agreed that the confiscation of the land and non-payments of the land would be the last restored of the government for the recovery of the land revenue. However, the money lenders and now the refused loans and therefore the riots were unable to pay land revenue and the violent revolt began in 1875. The life of the money lenders was not attacked but only the debt bonds were the bonded and therefore riot was aware of the tool of the operation. The result was the Deccan Agriculturalist Relief Act of 1879 which regulated interest rates and gave the protection against the loss of the land due to the indebtedness. Class 25. The emergence of the Indian national movement until the formation of the INC. The mentioned various revolt before INC. The some organization before INC, evolution of the INM. The Indian national movement was the product of the negativities of the British rule. The gradual progress from the regional to national organization, from the moderate to extremist to revolutionary phase. Nationalism as at the organized level at the top as the Saint peasant struggle on the ground emerged in the second half of the 19th century. The first contribution to the modern political and the modern nationalism come from the educated zamindars. The British Indian Association 1851 in Bengal, the first major voluntary organization in Indian compares educated zamindars thought the represented Jamindar's interest. It was the All Indian organization. It was the different from the Dwarka Nath Tagore's Landholder Society 1838, which had the many non official Anglo-Indians slash British. Bombay Association 1852 and Madras Native Association 1852 had the similar features, and the objectives of this organization were to send the petition of the British Parliament, which the drafting the Charter Act of 1853. They worked to raise the legitimate demand of the Indians and not just for land lords, thus the forming fraternity of the nationalism. The issue with this organization was they would be send three separate petition to land and not just a single petition. Thus there was a lack of the coordination among these organizations. The demand of this organization complained about the expenses and the incompetent administration, high taxation, neglected of the education and public workers, money and monopoly in the salt, opium and the production slash trade. Example, opening these sectors of the Indians. Therefore, did not oppose the British rule. अंग्रेज अंग्रेजों भारत छोड़ो, but the highlighted the Indians are not benefited for the British rule. These conservatives were the first contributors to the modern nationalism. They failed to achieve the objectives because the British assumed the unconditional loyalty of the landlord educated class, and they were the major beneficiary of the British rule. However, the post 1857 revolt, the leadership was provided by the landed class and the Indian princes. Instead of the support, the British nominated into the council set up under the Indian Council Act 1861, ICA 1861. The general factors behind the rise of the INM. The rapid spread of the Western education post 1857 revolt, inspired by the ideas of the modern nationalism, and the educated middle class took the leadership of the Indian national movement. The British wanted to create a Brown Sahib, however, the middle class intelligentsia used education to develop the Christianism of the British rule. It gained the momentum, especially when the educated middle class realized that the British had no intention of the sharing power with the Indians. However, uneven growth of the Western education led by the uneven growth of the INM. For example, since education was not free and British adopted the downward filtration theory, and the upper caste benefited more than the lower caste. Bombay, Madras and Bengal benefited more than the regions with the presidency, and the presidency towns benefited more than the other areas. The middle class benefited more than the peasantry, benefited the concerned by the communities like the Marathis, Tamils, Telugus, Hindus as the compared to the other communities like Gujarati, Telugu, Malayali, ODI, Assami Muslims. The result was the growth of the political activities in more educated area and the group. The rapid development of this phrase. The educated middle class used the press as the tool to raise the demand for the Indians, where the spread of the nationalist idea. For example, by the 1857, there were the roughly 400 Indian newspapers in English were vernacular, with the leadership from the 1.5 lakhs. As per result, the press increased the political consciousness, boosted the inter-regional awareness and the fraternity. The colonial institutions. The Legislative Council helped the growth of the INM as educated Indians companies for the council reform. Post 1892, moderates used the council for the demanding their rights of Indians. Growth of the railways and the telegraphs network. It led to the great connectedness. This allowed the greater interaction with the regional leadership. The great inter-regional awareness among the leaders of the INM led by the development of the pan-Indian leaders. The negatives of the British rule contributed to the rise of the INM. The racial tension led to the opposition of the British rule. Lex Loki Act was passed despite the huge opposition by the Hindus. Black Act 1850s brought the British born subject of the presidency town under the criminal jurisdiction of the ordinary court, with the Indians as a judge. 1833 judiciary open to the Indians. The act was put on the hold due to the high opposition by the Anglo-Indians. Therefore, the conflict increased the psychological distance between the two races. The rise of the cultural nationalism, a response to the increase in the racism and criticism of the Indian civilization post 1857. The taxation without representation, and no tax without representation is the core principle of the democracy. Income tax 1860 to 1868. In the 1860 and 70s, Indian witnessed the famine in its the different parts. Despite the income tax was introduced in 1860, this led to the massive protest in the press. As a result, it was the withdrawn but the reintroduced in 1868. Therefore, the taxation without representation become a grievances of the educated Indians. High expenditure on the home charge and the army combined with the increase in taxes, while the expenditure in the higher education increased in the 1870s due to increase the agitation by the educated Indians and press. The support by the Anglo-Indians began the propaganda that educated Indians are becoming the citizen. Therefore, the 1870s government decreased the expenditure on the higher education in the Bengal. Administration by the Lytton 1876 to 80 decreased the age limits of the civil services examination was from 21 to 19 years in 1876, while the demand for the simultaneous exam in India was the neglected. Therefore, the disturbed the Indians and did not want to their the representation in the senior position. Statutory Civil Service Act 1878, Lytton created the Statutory Civil Services to the operationalize the provision of an 1870 laws by the British Parliament that wanted more Indians in the civil services. Lytton, however, ensured that the only loyalists were the nominated to the statutory civil service, in the which the entry was the through the nomination, not examination. Thus, the 1877 to 80, the huge press campaign was started for the Indianization of the civil services by the Western educated Indians. The Imperials or the Delhi Darbar 1877, here the Queen Victoria got coronated with the title Kesare Hind, Empress of India. Therefore, the huge expenditure were the incurred, while the subcontinent witnessed frequent famines, can be used in the no taxation without representation as expenditure of taxes without the consent of the people. Vernacular Press Act 1878 to the curb the freedom of the press, as the vernacular press was the becoming increasingly critical of the British. Printers and the publisher of the vernacular press have the despite money as and the advance that the could be the fortified by the government if they publish the objectable consent. Example, anti-British. This lead to the huge agitation in the press by the educated Indians. Even the British parliamentarian Gladstone, a liberal, criticized that the Arm Act 1878, the Indians required to license to the town own arm, while Europeans and Eurasians did not. Therefore, racism was the operation BC Pal and started agitation against the Arm Act of 1878. The expensive Second Afghan War, 1878 to 80, also known as the Lytton's Afghan Adventure, as it was the available. It was the fought due to the fear of increasing Russian influence in Afghanistan, and the result in the treaty with the Russia after the war led to modern borders of Afghanistan. It was the unnecessary war expenditure at the time of the famines. In 1880, the Liberal Party come to the power in Britain. Therefore, Lytton was the replaced with the Liberal Ripon 1880 to 1884. The positive regime of the Ripon 1880 to 1884 the replaced the Vernacular Press Act 1878 in 1882. The Amendment Arms Act 1878 to remove the racially discriminatory provisions. Therefore, now all required licenses to the town arms. The increased age limit for the civil services examination for 19 to 21 years. The local self-government regulation 1882. There existed municipalities in the urban town and committees for the different worker like the sanitation, road construction, education, etc. in rural area. Therefore, they were under the official control. The Ripon strengthened the urban and the rural local bodies via the LSGR 1882. By the 1884, the effect was the visible in the whole of the British India. Its the purpose was the train Indians in the self-government, that not efficiency in administration. Now the rural area, the district boards and the talukas board were the set up across the whole of the British India, and there was the member were elected by the rent payers and the taxpayer instead of the nomination. The urban towns where the power of the municipalities increased. The minimum of the two-thirds were the elected members and a maximum of the one-third were nominated. The member of the Chairman was a non-official member. Subject of the health, education, road communication, etc. were the given the local bodies, which were the not be autonomous day-to-day functioning. However, the government would be inspect the dissolved the local bodies. The Hunter Commission 1882 to 1883, it recommended that the transfer of the education subject municipalities the district boards. The focus be on the mass western education in vernacular with the focus on the female education, a divine secondary education with the literacy or the vocational skill development branches. Elwart Bill controversy 1883 to 84. It was named after the C.P. Elwart, who was the law member of the Ripon Council. The bill gave the jurisdiction of Indian judges over the British-born subject in the Mufassil rural areas, and they already had the presidency town. The strongly opposed the Anglo-Indians of British official. Example, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal stated that the bill ignored the racial differences. The bill had to amend and the compromise were made to allow the trial by the mixed jury where the British-born subjects were involved. The controversy was the turning point of educated middle Indians as the bout of the subordination of the Indians where the British was removed. It was the important benchmark in the growth of the political activities due to the massive press propagandas. The proposal of the simultaneous civil services examination in the Indian failed. Therefore, the all position reform were the strongly opposed by the British in India, a regional organization of the middle class. They were set up the representing of the interest of the Indian Association 1876 by the Surendranath Banerjee in Bengal, the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha 1870 M.G. Ranade, K.T. Telang and Firoz Shah Mehta, Madras Mahajan Sabha 1884 S. Ramaswamy Mundaliar and the P. Pandaucharli. The Lahore Indian Association 1878 in Punjab by the Ajit Singh and the Lala Lajpat Rai. And they gradually replaced the domination of the conservation and organization of landed classes. Therefore, in 1870, there was a rise of the moderates and the middle class properly took up the leadership of the INM at the organized level. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe our channel and share with your friends. Thank you very much. Have a good day.